disgusting. The word was not merely spoken, it was hurled into the global consciousness with the force of a ballistic missile. When Donald Trump issued this scathing condemnation, it wasn't aimed at a political rival in Washington or a critical news outlet. It was aimed directly at the heart of the Vatican, specifically at the newly elevated and highly influential Pope Leo XIV. This single word has ignited a diplomatic firestorm that threatens to reshape the very foundation of Western alliances and moral authority during one of the most volatile periods in modern history. The world had barely begun to process the images of fire and smoke rising from tactical sites across Iran when the former president's eruption shifted the focus from the battlefield to a clash of ideologies that few saw coming. This is not just a disagreement over foreign policy. It is a fundamental collision between the doctrine of overwhelming strength and the philosophy of radical pacifism. The strike itself was a masterclass in military precision, a calculated maneuver that left the Middle East reeling and global markets in a state of suspended animation. Within the immediate 24-hour window of the attack, while smoke still billowed from the targeted Iranian facilities, the international community waited for a unified voice of resolve or restraint. Instead, they received a profound and jarring fracture. From the quiet, sun-drenched corridors of Mar-a-Lago to the ancient, echoing halls of St. Peter's Basilica, the responses could not have been more divergent. Donald Trump, the architect of the strength-first doctrine, saw the military action as a necessary assertion of national security and a deterrent against further aggression. To him, the strike was a clear signal that the era of strategic patience had ended and that American interests would be protected at any cost. However, Pope Leo XIV, a figure whose rapid rise to global influence has been defined by an uncompromising commitment to religious pacifism, saw things differently. Moving with a speed that caught many career diplomats off guard, the Pope issued a public plea for immediate de-escalation. He spoke of the sanctity of human life and the poisonous fruit of military aggression, effectively casting a shadow of moral doubt over the strategic victory celebrated by the American right. It was this specific stance, this moral intervention into a matter of high-stakes military strategy, that pushed Trump to his breaking point. To the former president, the Pope's call for peace was not an act of holiness, but an act of profound betrayal. He interpreted the Vatican's message as a sign of debilitating weakness, a direct threat to the safety of the Western world that emboldened adversaries rather than restraining them. The tension is now palpable, creating a curiosity gap that has the entire world asking, what exactly did Pope Leo XIII say in those private communiques and public addresses that triggered such a visceral public eruption from Trump? The former president's rhetoric suggests that there is more to this disagreement than a simple difference of opinion. This is a battle for the soul of global leadership. On one side stands a man who believes that peace is only maintained through the credible threat of overwhelming force and the willingness to use it. On the other stands a religious leader who argues that the cycle of violence can only be broken by the courage to lay down arms regardless of the perceived provocation. As news cycles churn and social media feeds fill with heated debates between those who demand military retaliation and those who plead for moral restraint, the sense of urgency is undeniable. We are witnessing a moment where the lines between political pragmatism and religious authority are being blurred in real time. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The world feels as though it is standing on a precarious brink, where a single misstep or a further escalation in this war of words could tip the scales toward a conflict far greater than the one currently unfolding in the Middle East. The stage is now set for a confrontation that transcends borders and beliefs, as the fallout from the Iran strike forces every global citizen to consider where their loyalties truly lie in a world divided by strength and spirit. The military strike that sparked this ideological inferno was characterized by its surgical coldness. Intelligence reports describe a series of coordinated, high-altitude drone strikes and long-range missile launches that targeted key command centers and enrichment facilities deep within Iranian territory. The war attack, as it has come to be known, was designed to decapitate the infrastructure of aggression without a full-scale ground invasion. This tactical move was calculated. Yet, the tactical strikes did little to dampen the immediate global outcry. In the hours following the explosions, The chaotic aftermath was broadcast across the digital world. Images of thick smoke rising from desert bunkers and the frantic sirens of emergency vehicles echoed through the streets of Tehran. This was the catalyst, the spark that transformed a regional conflict into a fierce global debate over the morality of preemptive warfare. As the dust settled over the target zones, Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. His presence was not marked by generic calls for quiet, but by a searing indictment of the military operation. He did not hide behind the veil of diplomatic ambiguity. The Pope remained firm. The Pope spoke with a resonant gravity about the sanctity of peace and launched a direct, unprecedented criticism of what he termed unbridled military aggression. He argued that no strategic gain could justify the risk of a global conflagration. In his view, the strike was an affront to the inherent dignity of the human person and a dangerous departure from the path of dialogue. It was a declaration that sought to strip the operation of its tactical legitimacy. The response from Donald Trump was instantaneous and explosive. Utilizing his digital platforms and a brief appearance before reporters, he unleashed a torrent of criticism that stunned observers. He didn't just disagree with the Pope, he sought to dismantle the foundation of his relevance. Trump labeled the Pope's comments as disgusting and out of touch with reality, suggesting the leader of the Catholic Church was operating in a theological vacuum with no bearing on the facts of national survival. He argued that while the Pope sits safely behind the secure walls of the Vatican, American leaders deal with the real world, existential threats of nuclear proliferation and state-sponsored terrorism. This clash has created a rising tension that goes beyond a mere political disagreement. It is a fundamental war of words between two radically different visions for the future of the West. The stakes could not be higher for global stability. On one side, Trump represents a political pragmatism that views overwhelming strength as the only true guarantor of peace. To him, the strike was not an act of aggression, but a defensive necessity. On the other side, Pope Leo XIV represents a radical religious pacifism that views any act of war as a step toward collective destruction. This ideological divide is widening, pitting those who believe in peace through strength against those who believe in peace through sacrifice. Trump's rebuttal contained specific, biting phrases that questioned whether the Vatican even understood the nature of the enemies the West currently faces. He pointedly asked how a religious leader could lecture a superpower on the morality of defense when they themselves reside in a protected enclave. Does a religious leader have a place in military strategy? Let us know below and hit like if you're following this breaking story. This question is now at the heart of the global conversation. The firestorm has since migrated to the digital arena, where the escalation is visible in every comment section. Trump supporters argue that the Pope is overstepping his bounds, meddling in matters of statecraft that he is neither qualified for nor responsible for. Conversely, Vatican supporters see the Pope as the last moral check on a world spiraling toward total war. This social media battle is a global divide that is splitting families and political parties. The rhetoric is becoming personal, as both sides accuse the other of endangering the future of humanity. The ripple effects of this ideological collision reached far beyond the halls of the Vatican or the rooms of Mar-a-Lago. Across the globe, world leaders found themselves backed into a corner, forced to articulate where they stood in a landscape suddenly defined by two irreconcilable poles. In European capitals, the tension was acute. Some leaders, wary of American unilateralism and deeply rooted in a tradition of social diplomacy, gravitated toward Pope Leo XIV's moral authority. They saw his call for restraint as a necessary brake on a situation that could easily spiral out of control. Meanwhile, others, particularly those in Eastern Europe and certain Middle Eastern allies, felt the pull of Trump's strength-first doctrine. For these nations, the reality of a nuclear-capable Iran was not a theological debate, but a direct threat to their survival. They viewed the strike as a bold assertion of Western resolve that the Vatican simply failed to grasp. This rift began to fray the edges of long-standing alliances, as common defense strategies were suddenly viewed through the lens of this public, high-stakes spat. Within the domestic sphere of America, the consequences were equally jarring. Voters who traditionally found common ground in their religious faith and their support for a strong national defense were suddenly torn by a conflict of loyalties. For many, the choice was agonizing. Vatican supporters argued that the moral compass of the West was being discarded for the sake of political expediency, insisting that peace at all costs was the only way to prevent a Third World War. They feared that ignoring the Pope's warning was a step toward a godless, perpetual state of conflict where human life is reduced to a statistic. On the other side, Trump supporters remained adamant that defense and retaliation were not just rights, but absolute necessities for a sovereign nation. They argued that the Pope's pacifism, while noble in a pulpit, was a dangerous liability in a world where adversaries do not respect the sanctity of life or the rules of international law. They saw Trump's eruptive rhetoric as a necessary defense of the secular world's duty to protect its citizens from tangible, violent threats that do not pause for prayer or reflection. The climax of this extraordinary exchange occurred during a secondary press conference at Mar-a-Lago, where Trump delivered a rhetorical question that left the diplomatic world in a state of stunned silence. He looked directly into the cameras, his expression a mask of stern defiance, and asked if the leaders of the world chose to lay down their arms tomorrow based on a moral plea. Would the enemies of the West do the same? Or would they simply see it as the final invitation to finish what they started? He challenged the Pope to explain how a sanctity of peace would protect a civilian city from a hypersonic missile. The silence that followed was not one of agreement, but of profound realization that the gap between these two men was no longer bridgeable. It was a moment that stripped away the pleasantries of international relations, revealing a raw and terrifying divide in human thought. The world now waits with bated breath to see if the Vatican will issue a formal response or an official diplomatic protest. While some believe Pope Leo XIV will double down on his message of de-escalation with a formal encyclical, others suspect the Holy See may pivot toward a quieter, more traditional form of back-channel diplomacy to avoid further inflaming the situation. Regardless of the next move, the tension continues to simmer, casting a long shadow over the ongoing military operations in the Middle East. If these two titans cannot agree on a path toward peace, many fear that the momentum of history is pulling the world toward an inevitable and total war. The conflict between Donald Trump and Pope Leo XIV has proven that the most dangerous battlefields are sometimes not in the desert, but in the hearts and minds of those who lead. To stay informed as this crisis develops, subscribe to the channel and watch the next video on your screen. The future of global stability may depend on what happens next.